Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to California Department of Education Tuesday at 2 webinar on local indicators in the LCAP. I'm Jeff Brashears with the Local Agency System Support Office. And later joining me in the presentation will be Jonathan Fiegel. So we're talking about the local indicators and how it would influence the development of the LCAP. So really the local indicators is the opportunity, it reinforces the idea of subsidiarity, which is the foundation by which local control funding formula was based and given the control to the local community. And so this is the opportunity there to measure its performance on state priorities. Here you can see the list for which there are no state indicators. So contrasting with the state indicator, that is the data that is collected and reported by the LEA to the state, and whereas local indicators, again, is based on that data attached and collected locally and analyzed locally at the level. And that's, again, where we're going to go and talk about how that influences the development of the LCAP for those LCFF priorities. So just note, and as a reminder, that local indicators apply to all LEAs. And for LCFF, this is defined as a county office of education, a school district, and charter schools. And just note that for LCFF, the funding stream or the funding determination of charter schools does not matter. It is, they are for LCFF and LEA. Local indicators do not apply to individual schools. So here are the current performance standards for local indicators, and this was these were revised at the January 2020 State Board. Here that the changes to it, in addition to not only annually measure the progress in meeting the requirements of the specific LCFF priority, but you can see here that the addition is that these must be a part of a non-consent item at a regularly scheduled public meeting of the local governing board or body. And this is done in conjunction with the adoption of the LCAP. There's nothing in statute that says it can or cannot be a separate item of the adoption of the LCAP, but we would recommend it's just part of that transparency and the ability to have a discussion as have it as a separate item. But again, it is not mandated. It is mandated to be a part as the state board adopted a non-consent item. So after all the work is done, then the LEA will use the self-reflection tool as the vehicle by which to report its learnings through to the dashboard, to the public through the dashboard. Again, that the report of the local indicators is not just a matter of filling out a self-reflection tool. The self-reflection tool is a vehicle to report one's result and one's performance on these local indicators of these LCFF priorities, using that, again, that self-reflection tool to the California School Dashboard. Here you can see that the indicator, the self-reflection tool, can be accessed through the local performance indicator quick guide, and there is the web page to get that document. So looking at it, though, here's the timeline that we'll talk about through today. Is the standards, the performance standards for the local indicators for those priorities was adopted and changed in January 2020. So then the LEAs then will collect and analyze current data, local data, to inform, to assess their progress of those priorities, and then report their findings through to the local governing board, like we talked about, in conjunction with the adoption of the LCAP. So this work is a lot of work to be done between now and July 1, statute on or before July 1, and again, use that data that one collected at the local level. And then in the early summer, we're working to change that reporting window for dashboard coordinators to be reset and then report its progress using the self-reflection tool in the early summer into the dashboard. So going back here to the second bubble, the collecting and analyze most current local data. For each of these local indicators, these LCFF priorities, the LEA needs first to decide what data it is going to collect in reference to that priority and the metrics that are included, if they are included in that priority, how to collect the data, and then obviously collect the data, and then spend some time to analyze the data, drawing conclusion, identifying needs, which is what would then inform us. We'll talk about it a little bit using priority 7 as an example to identify those needs and develop either goals or actions to achieve a goal within the LCAP. So after the LEA has done all of this, then the LEA will use the self-reflection tool to report that performance through the dashboard.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Jonathan Fiegel in the LASSO office, and we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to look at the intersection of the local indicators and the LCAP. So there, the new template, the new LCAP template, is designed to incorporate the local indicator process into the development of the LCAP. And there are a couple of places in the LCAP where the local indicators are explicitly referenced, and that's in the plan summary section and the goals and action section. If you look in the plan summary section, the instructions for the identified need prompt, and just to reiterate an important point that we made in our last week's webinar, the instructions for the prompts in the LCAP have a lot more detail. And a good rule of thumb is when you're completing the LCAP, don't respond to the prompts, respond to the instructions, because the instructions will be much more detailed. So, for example, when responding to the identified need prompt in the plan summary section, the dashboard, the template requires LEAs to identify performance using state indicators, overall performance in which performance is red or orange, or for which the performance of any student group was 2 or more performance levels below the all-student performance level. But also other needs can be identified using essentially the data and the lessons learned through completion of the local indicators, and all what I tend to refer to as the local indicator process. But it's just all the process, all the work that goes into completing that the local indicators and getting to a point where you have sufficient data to then sit down and fill out the self-reflection tools in the dashboard. So that's in the plan summary. In the goals and action section, the instructions encourage LEAs to prioritize their goals and actions within priorities. And one of the ways it does that is to encourage LEAs to look at their locally collected data that's part of that work for the local indicators. Not just their state indicators, but looking at the lessons learned through the local indicator process. And this isn't so much whether or not you have met or not met on the dashboard, but looking at the narrative responses and the way the information that's provided on the self-reflection tools and the lessons learned as you arrive to those conclusions. How can all that information inform the LCAP? A third place where the template is designed to incorporate local data and the local indicators is in the goals and actions section. So in the measuring and reporting results part of the goal now for metrics, metrics that can be quantitative or qualitative, and an LEA you're required to address all of the applicable state priorities, including all of the metrics within an applicable state priority. So if you address attendance, you can't check off priority 5, right? You have to address all the metrics in priority 5. And so for some of those metrics, for some of the priorities, the metrics that are included under the priority are fairly clear. For example, like suspension rate, and what 2% suspension rate means for one LEA, it means the same thing at another LEA, and that's why it's a state indicator, right? Not a local indicator. But you also want to use metrics that are based on the work done to complete the local indicator process and to fill out the self-reflection tools. And in some cases, the self-reflection tools may provide examples of metrics to use. In other cases, you may come up with your own metrics as you're measuring your own progress to then report through the self-reflection tools on the dashboard. And so we see, sort of again and again here, this is really where local control or subsidiarity happens, right, in this accountability scheme. So one more point before I move on to the next section. Another benefit of looking at your local data, and again, local data doesn't mean necessarily just data that is collected to inform the local indicator process, but also the local data that you have about your current, where you are currently with your attendance rate, or where you are currently with your suspension rate, and all of the metrics for all the priorities. So when you, for example, I'm going to go back a couple of slides. When you're responding to the identified need prompt in the plan summary section, it says to identify those state indicators for which performance was in the red or orange. And when you do that, keep in mind that that's going to be based on data in the prior year. So by also incorporating locally collected data, you can provide data that's more current than what is captured in the dashboard. So we're going to pause here for a second and take some questions.
Hi, this is Jeff, and I'm going to answer a couple questions that we put out there. One is, were the self-reflections changed at the SBE meeting? No, they were not. The standards were changed by how to go about this. One still collects the data locally, reports that data to its local governing board or body at a regular scheduled meeting. The change there was that it has to be done in conjunction with the adoption of the LCAP and as a non-consent item. And then I want to say one other thing, going back to this reflection timeline that I forgot to add, is this process that one will go through now is to inform the 2020 dashboard. So I know that this is a short turnaround timeline based on what was done for the 2019 dashboard, but it is new data, new recent data to inform the LCAP and to report its findings to the dashboard. The metrics, we are in the process of putting together a list of the metrics, but they are found in Education Code 52060, or if you're County Office of Education, 52066. But we will put out a flyer, if you will, or a sheet that has the list of different priorities and the associated metrics. And then again, on this last part where it says the early summer, the dashboard to reset. So we are working with the developers at this point to get it as close to the early part of July as we can. So an LEA is holding on to that report and that data and waiting for the window that we've had, mid-August to early November, but to really look at resetting the dashboard coordinator and resetting the dashboard early part of July. And then once an LEA has registered, if you will, their dashboard coordinator, they would have access to the dashboard to upload those results. I'd like to go to a resort, but that's different. I'll be right back with you. We have a great, question. It's talking about to clarify that they collect data during the school year, use it in the spring as part of the needs assessment to develop the LCAP. Obviously, you're going to report it to the board during the LCAP adoption in June, and it, as statute says, in conjunction with. So if you're finished early, you can't bring it before. It must be in conjunction with, meaning the same meeting at which the board will adopt its LCAP. Again, let me clarify that the standards is to report the results as part of a non-consent item at a regularly scheduled meeting in conjunction with the adoption of the LCAP. The purpose of that is to ensure at the local level the opportunity to have a discussion regarding the results of these LCFF priorities.
Okay, this is Jonathan again, and we'll continue on with looking at how the local indicators can inform the LCAP. So we're going to look at priority 7, which is a broad course of study. And we're going to look at the self-reflection tool and see how that might help us, see how the self-reflection tool merges into the LCAP. So for a broad course of study, the LEA provides a narrative in response to 4 different prompts, and we'll look at those prompts in just a second. One thing to keep in mind is the broad course of study applies to all grades 1st through 12th grade. There's EdCode section that describes a broad course of study for elementary school, and then there's a separate EdCode section that provides a broad course of study for middle and high school. That's a point worth bearing. I think more often we do notice that sometimes LEAs think a broad course of study applies just to high school or middle school and high school. So for the first, again, there's 4 narrative prompts in the self-reflection tool for a broad course of study. And so again, we're looking at the 4 prompts that are part of the self-reflection tool. When you go to report your progress on the dashboard using the self-reflection tool, these are the 4 prompts that an LEA will need to respond to. And notice the response is limited to 1,500 characters. And so before you get to this point, before you get to where you're filling out the self-reflection tool, you've done all this work, throughout the course of the year, collecting and analyzing and learning from your data about an LEA's performance in this particular area. So for the first prompt, it's asking the LEA to identify the measures and or the tools that the LEA used to track performance in this area. The second one is asking the LEA to summarize their performance in this area, including any differences across school sites or student groups. In the third prompt, an LEA is identifying any of the barriers that are preventing the LEA from performing at a higher level in this area. And then in 4, this is basically what's going to happen as a result of what was learned and moving forward. And here in the narrative response given to 4, this is where you can see how the design of the self-reflection tool is, how the self-reflection tool is designed to merge into the LCAP. So we're going to look at each of those 4 in part here. So here, this is the Cliff Notes version of those 4 questions, right? Just to review, right? What measures or tools are used? To what extent are all students having access and are enrolled in a broad course of study? And what differences across school sites and student groups? What are the barriers? And then what happens moving forward? What measures, actions, goals result from what you learned in this process? And that's the information that can get plugged in, that would feed into the LCAP. So I'm going to go through each. I'm going to look at each of these 4. We're going to look at each of these 4 in turn. And so what we did was we looked at the dashboard and we looked at just random LEAs to take sort of a sampling of the kinds of results that LEAs are providing to each of these questions. And it's by no means a systematic study, and it really was just sort of random, we picked. And obviously there's no identifying information, and some numbers have been changed for that reason. But I'm going to go through and just sort of provide some examples, some representative examples of what we found, that you can kind of compare, to what you're using, or the kind of responses you have. These are not exemplars necessarily, right? Just what we found. In the process, as we go through this, if you have anything that you think could be added to the slide, it could be added to the list for each of these, please go ahead and type it into the box. And as given on how many responses we have, and as time permits, we'll repeat back to all the participants some additional ideas there. And we won't mention anybody's name. It'll still be private. So looking at 1, so what measures or tools are used? So for a broad course of study, these were 4 of the things that were listed more often than not as measures or tools used. So they would look at site schedules, graduation requirements, master schedule tool to track course enrollment. There was mentions of tools or instruments that LDAs actually use to track the enrollment, and then the report cards. So these are the things that the LDAs are looking at and using to assess their performance. It doesn't necessarily mean that these things provide an assessment of performance, but they are close to the data that's used by the LEAs to draw conclusions and findings and learn from the data, right? The learning and the evaluating as a higher order process that's done at the local level. I'm just going to pause for a second. I'm going to see if any of the participants have any other ideas that might, or any other measures or tools that are being used out there. So we got a few ideas here. So one of them was CalPAD's end of year 1 report, 3.9, 3.10, and 3.11 can be used for priority 7. Thank you for that one. Another one, somebody says that they use the document that they prepare for the CalPAD's Fall 2 reporting. Yes, that's a really good one, and also it's more current, right? It's some of the more current data that's going to the state. Another one mentions artist residency schedules district-wide. So that's a really good one. Very good. So those are a lot of other things that are being used to measure performance in this area. So I'm going to go on to the second one. And the same with this one. I'll pause too at the end when I finish talking over this slide to see if anybody else has some other things to add to the list. So for the second one, right, you're summarizing the extent to which your students have access to and are enrolled in a broad course of study. and any differences across school sites and student groups. So, for example, one LEA, and again, this this bullet list here is not in itself an adequate response to the narrative. It's not intended to be a comprehensive adequate response to the narrative, to the prompt, but just sort of a representative example of the kinds of bits of information that are included in a bigger, more comprehensive response. So 88% of 7th graders completed world language course, 75% of unduplicated 7th graders completed world language course, and 60% of special education 7th graders completed world language course. And so, again, here, right, they're sort of uncovering some disparities, some disproportionalities, and the world language course, that's the first, or that's one of the requirements for a broad course of study is that students begin a world language by 7th grade. So I'll pause here again and see what other things we have in the list. Okay, so someone made a really good point that access is it's not just about scheduling creating, but you have to actually create the access. And so access, I think it's a really good. It highlights the fact that priority 7 is, right, it's not like suspension rate, right? It's not that cut and dry on how to calculate performance in the area. So, priority 7, access to and enrollment in, well, what does access mean, right? What does enrollment mean? And in this case, access, it probably isn't just simply making the classes available. The students have, are they actually able to go into the classroom, and are they in a state of mind to receive the instruction? Right, there's quite a spectrum of points there to be made about access. So the person that made this point, they say they also look, for this reason, they also look at their MTSS plans, IEPs, the EL roadmap interventions. So that's a really good point. Thank you for that one. Another one. Right. So, and going back to the access point, someone else makes a point that reporting it on the dashboard for stakeholders, simply using the term unduplicated isn't very specific, right? So it might be better if you track the percentage of, in this case on this slide, where we're talking about percentage of completion percentages for world language courses. So it would be more helpful, right, if you knew the percentage of your low-income students, percentage of your English learners, and your foster youth, right, separately, and what those completion rates are, because there are very different needs associated with those different groups. So that's a really good point. Thank you. All right, so moving on to 3. What are the barriers? So again, right, this list would not be an adequate response in itself to the prompt. It's just some representative bits of information that we saw in some of the more comprehensive responses to the third prompt. So some of the barriers: matching credentialing of existing teachers to desired electives, meeting credentialing requirements to teach dual enrollment courses, over and under representation of student groups in specific classes, and specifically to that third point. We saw at least in a couple of instances language to the effect that the LEA was recognizing that certain student groups were either self-selecting or just being systematically tracked out of college preparatory pathways and into minimum graduation requirement pathways or CTE pathways, and that was something that needed to be looked at. So again, I'm going to pause here and see if there are any other barriers that anyone out there is experiencing that would be helpful to point out and add to the list. All right, so no more barriers. So that's something that we'll want to take a closer look at. Make sure that we have a good description of barriers. And again, right, this what's a barrier in one LEA, right, is going to be different from one LEA to another. And so the last prompt here: what measures, actions, goals, result? So a couple of representative examples that were either explicitly tied to world language courses or could reasonably be sort of associated with it. One was support teachers with the training or credentialing programs needed. Again, that's probably more of an action, or that would be a little vague for an action. Maybe it's a goal, a more narrow in scope goal. And then the second example there of some information found in the narrative responses. Increased 7th grade world language course completion rate to 95% for all students. So that's like an expected outcome, right? And so you go through and just the one point I think to really reiterate here is to get to this point of providing this information, the self-reflection tool. The LEA has done a whole lot of back work in terms of setting up systems for continuous improvement. Evaluating, tracking, monitoring, and collecting information and data, and looking at it and learning from it. The LEAs that can become learning organizations are the ones that can do this, and this really fits into their sort of everyday work, more naturally. And so once you've done all that, you get down and you have that information, and now you can respond to these prompts here in the self-reflection tool. So what does this look like in the LCAP? So this is the measuring and reporting results. And again, this is just one example out of a million or an infinite number of possibilities. So we have the metric on the left there, percent of 7th grade students completing a world language course with C or better, and the same percentage of unduplicated 7th grade students. But as someone mentioned earlier, maybe we need to, as an LEA, we need to build in capacity to track more focused, to track our performance for more specific student groups. So the 3 student groups that make up unduplicated student groups, at low-income, English learner, foster youth, and there's a lot of other student groups too, right? That can be tracked. And so for the baseline, we have 88%, right? Was for the all student performance level, but collectively the unduplicated student groups are at 75%. And so where do we want to be in 3 years at the end of this LCAP? And we put the desired outcome there on the far right. And so 95% for both. So we've identified a performance gap by doing this, and we've shown how, to the extent to which we want to close that performance gap. And then as we fill out the LCAP in succeeding years, we will put our actual outcomes in the appropriate column there, year 1, 2, and 3, so on. So that is basically it. That was today's webinar. And so we will pause. We're going to pause here and see if there are any questions that come up. So there's a question about year 1, 2, and 3 outcomes. I'm going to go back to here. And so we do have a webinar coming up on the goals and action section where we will dive into this in more detail. But this is a really good question that is worth addressing now. So yeah, so for the LCAP that you're currently developing or starting to develop and will be adopted by your board on or before July 1 and will be active for the 2020 M-21 LCAP year. The year 1 outcome, year 2, and year 3 outcome columns will be blank, right? Or in some cases you might leave the insert outcome here, but it will be blank. This is this is one of the ways that we see how the new goals and action section has incorporated the functionality of the annual update section. So we don't have an annual update section anymore, and we've merged the functions of the annual update and the goals section sort of together. And so this time next year, next spring, right, when you're doing the 2021 M-22 LCAP, you will then fill in your year one outcome, and that would be equivalent to filling out your actual outcomes in the old annual update section. Just a point of clarification, the new redesigned template does not have an annual update section. However, for the LCAP being developed now for 2020-21, there is what you might call a bridge annual update section, and that is to close out the 2017-20 LCAP, and that'll be the annual update for that LCAP. And that'll be included with the 2021 LCAP that gets posted, but it's really just there to close out the prior year LCAP. There's some questions about just the overall timing and the timeline of the indicators and how they fit into the whole process. So the work, the data that you report to the dashboard by filling out and completing the self-reflection tools for the 2020 dashboard is going to be information and that's collected this school year, right, up through the time that you're developing your LCAP. So so like right now, for example, you might have processes in place that are sort of passively or actively collecting information that at some point you'll sit down and look at and then use that to inform your LCAP, as well as use it to complete the self-reflection tools when the reporting window is open this summer and fall. But what happened what happened in prior years is because the reporting window for the local indicators was open, for after the school year was over and into the next school year, some LEAs collected data for sort of the subsequent school year and reported it as if it was indicative of the prior school year. So there was a timing issue there.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thanks again for joining us today for the on Tuesday at 2 local webinar for local indicators. Next week, we're going to talk about the 2019-20 annual updates template and section, as Jonathan talked about, which would close out the 2017 through 20 LCAP template, and then also talk about the e-template. That's next week. So for that, we again thank you for your time and attention, to your interaction, your input, and we bid you a fair afternoon. Thanks. Good day.